You're in the shower, or driving, or trying to fall asleep. And then it comes back. The conversation you had 3 days ago. The reply you should have given, but only thought of afterward. The explanation that would have made everything clearer, if only it had come at the right moment. The sentence the other person said that somehow still hasn't settled in your mind. Or just as often, the conversation that hasn't happened yet. What you're going to say. What they'll probably say in return. What you'll say after that. Then version B, if they answer differently. And version C, your mind builds the entire dialogue, giving both people their lines, refining details, rewriting sections, testing different angles, with a level of attention and precision it rarely gives to anything else. Why does the brain do this? Why does this particular function, rehearsing and replaying conversations, consume so much of the mental time that logically should be focused on something else? The answer begins with a perspective that completely changes how we understand this pattern. Not as a flaw, not as weakness, not as oversensitivity, but as the normal operation of a system that has spent millions of years evolving to do exactly this. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar at the University of Oxford spent decades investigating what makes the human brain, and especially the human neocortex, different from that of other primates. The answer he arrived at wasn't tool use. It wasn't abstract problem solving. It wasn't technical intelligence. It was the ability to manage complex social networks. Dunbar demonstrated that, across primates, the size of the neocortex is directly correlated with the size of the social groups each species can maintain. Primates with larger neocortices live in larger groups and manage more complex social relationships. For humans, Dunbar estimated that the cognitive limit of stable social relationships is around 150 people, a finding that became known as Dunbar's number. But what he emphasized wasn't simply the number. It was what the number represents. Maintaining 150 active relationships requires constant, sophisticated processing that consumes enormous cognitive resources. Who's getting along with whom? Who's in conflict? Who said what about whom? Where do I stand within the group? Is my reputation still intact? According to Dunbar, this is one of the primary functions the human neocortex evolved to perform. Not abstract calculation, not logical analysis, but managing status and relationships within a complex social group. What this means is that when your mind spends hours rehearsing and replaying a conversation, it's doing exactly the kind of work it was optimized to do. It's not wasting mental resources. It's allocating them to the task the system considers most important. And for a social species whose survival has always depended on the group, the most important task is protecting your place within that group and preserving your relationships. The psychologist Mark Leary at Duke University developed a theory that connects this evolutionary imperative to a very specific emotional mechanism. He called it the sociometer. Leary's central idea is that self-esteem isn't simply an opinion you have about yourself. It's a monitoring system, an internal gauge, much like the speedometer in a car, that continuously tracks your perceived level of social acceptance. When that gauge is high, when the system senses that you're valued, accepted, and securely positioned within your social groups, self-esteem remains high and the system stays calm. But when the gauge drops, when an interaction suggests that your social acceptance may have been compromised, that someone is unhappy with you, or that something in the relationship feels unsettled, self-esteem drops with it. And along with that drop comes a very specific kind of anxiety designed to push the system into restoring the gauge. Now connect the sociometer to conversation rehearsal, a conversation that didn't go well, a response that came out wrong, an awkward silence that lingered, a feeling that you were misunderstood. To the sociometer, these are exactly the kinds of events that make the gauge fall. The sociometer isn't signaling, "That was uncomfortable." It's signaling, "Your social acceptance may have been compromised." This requires attention, and the way the system tries to pay attention to a problem involving social standing is by doing exactly what the neocortex evolved to do: process, simulate, rehearse. Search, within the simulation, for the version of the conversation that would have kept the sociometer where it belongs. That's why the conversation that comes back while you're in the shower isn't random. It's the conversation your sociometer marked as unresolved, the interaction whose meaning in terms of social acceptance is still uncertain. Think about how this plays out in real life. The disagreement with a coworker that ended ambiguously, with no clear resolution and no real sense of where things stand. The conversation with a family member who said something that might have been criticism or might have been completely neutral, and your system never received confirmation either way. The email that was read but never answered, leaving the status of the relationship suspended in uncertainty. In every one of these situations, the sociometer never received the signal that the gauge had returned to normal, and until that signal arrives, the system keeps processing, it keeps rehearsing, it keeps searching inside the simulation for the version of events that would restore the certainty that your social acceptance is still secure. But here's the central problem behind all of this. The missing piece that explains why the rehearsal continues even after hours of replaying the conversation. To simulate a conversation, the system needs a model of the other person, a representation of how they think, what they feel, and what they're likely to say. And that representation, no matter how sophisticated it seems, has one fundamental limitation. It isn't the other person. It's your internal version of the other person. And those two things are far less alike than your system assumes. The researcher Rebecca Sachs at MIT became well known for a discovery that seems simple but carries enormous implications. Using functional MRI, she identified a specific region of the brain, the temporoparietal junction, located where the temporal and parietal lobes meet in the right hemisphere, that consistently becomes active when a person is thinking about what someone else is thinking or feeling. Not when they're thinking about objects, not when they're solving mathematical problems, specifically and especially when they're simulating another person's mental state. This ability, known as theory of mind or mentalizing, is one of the most sophisticated cognitive capacities humans possess. The ability to recognize that other people have thoughts, beliefs, desires, and intentions of their own, different from yours. To construct within your own mind a representation of another person's inner world. When you rehearse a conversation, your temporoparietal junction is active. You're running a simulation of the other person, building a model of how they think, what they feel, and how they're likely to respond. Generating their side of the conversation inside your mind with a level of realism that can feel remarkably convincing. But what the psychologist Nicholas Epley at the University of Chicago spent years documenting is something that completely changes the way we understand that simulation. Epley systematically studied the human ability to read minds, the ability to infer what another person is thinking or feeling, and what he found, experiment after experiment, is that people consistently overestimate this ability. We believe we know far more about what other people think and feel than we actually do. We assume our internal model of them is more accurate than it really is. We trust our interpretations of their motives, reactions, and intentions far more than the evidence actually justifies. One of the specific biases Epley identified is what he described as a reverse delusion of transparency, the tendency to project our own perspective onto other people, to assume they see a situation much more like we do than they actually do. When you rehearse what you're going to say in a difficult conversation, that rehearsal is built on a prediction of how the other person will receive your words, and that prediction is based largely on how you would receive them, filtered through your own perspective, your own history, your own frame of reference, not theirs. This creates a very recognizable pattern in conversation rehearsal. The real conversation doesn't unfold the way you planned because the other person doesn't follow the script. They don't say what your model predicted. They don't react the way your simulation expected. They interpret things in a way your rehearsal never anticipated. And when the system encounters the gap between what it predicted and what actually happened, it doesn't conclude that the model was inaccurate. It concludes that the rehearsal wasn't thorough enough, that it needs more refinement, that somewhere there must be a version of the rehearsal that would have predicted everything correctly. And so the entire process begins again. This cycle has one feature that makes it especially persistent. It has no clear stopping point. When rehearsing a future conversation, the real conversation hasn't happened yet, so the model can never truly be tested or confirmed. There's always another response you haven't considered, always another variation that might deserve attention. The rehearsal can continue indefinitely, and a system driven to reduce social uncertainty has every reason to keep going. When replaying a past conversation, the conversation is already over. It can't be changed. But your internal model of what I should have said can be refined forever. The perfect response always seems to exist in theory. So the system keeps searching for it inside the simulation, even while knowing it can never actually be spoken. Think about how this unfolds in one very ordinary situation. A conversation with someone close to you ends with unresolved tension. The words have been spoken. The conversation is over. But over the next few hours, your mind gets to work. It reconstructs the scene, finds the point where you could have answered differently, rehearses the alternative version, imagines how the other person would have reacted to that alternative, then identifies yet another place where you could have responded differently within that imagined version. And the cycle continues. Every iteration feels like it's getting closer to a resolution. Every refinement seems more convincing than the one before. But the resolution never comes, because the resolution the system is searching for doesn't exist inside the rehearsal. It exists only outside of it. If this describes something you've recognized in your own mind, that specific cycle of replaying and rehearsing conversations that always seems to need one more round, this channel exists to put a name to exactly that experience. Subscribe so the next video is already waiting for you, but there's still one important piece missing, because the imperfect simulation and the endless rehearsal explain why the process continues. What they still don't explain is why the system consistently prioritizes the conversations that were left unresolved instead of the ones that went well. Why the good conversation almost never comes back while you're in the shower, but the ambiguous one returns dozens of times. The answer lies in a mechanism the nervous system uses to deal with uncertainty, and in an imperative far more fundamental than any simple preference in how the mind processes information. There is a distinction that is almost never made explicitly about rehearsing conversations, but it explains nearly everything about why we do it. The system does not process all social interactions with the same intensity. It devotes far more attention to interactions that ended without a clear conclusion. A conversation that ended well, with mutual understanding and both people leaving with a good feeling, rarely comes back. It has been processed, filed away, and the sociometer records social acceptance intact. But a conversation that ended ambiguously, with no confirmation that everything is okay, no certainty about what the other person is thinking, no clarity about where the relationship stands, remains active. Not because you choose to keep thinking about it, but because the system automatically treats social uncertainty as incomplete information that still needs to be resolved. The psychologist Ari Kruglanski at the University of Maryland spent decades studying a cognitive drive that he identified as one of the most powerful and most underestimated in human psychology. He called it the need for cognitive closure. The need for cognitive closure is the desire to reach a definite answer to an unresolved question. Any definite answer. Not necessarily the correct one, but one that ends the ambiguity. One that allows the system to stop processing the issue and move on. Kruglanski showed that this need varies across people and across situations. In some circumstances, especially when uncertainty feels particularly costly, the need for closure becomes much stronger, and social uncertainty is one of the forms of uncertainty the human mind experiences as especially costly. For a species in which exclusion from the group meant dramatically lower chances of survival throughout most of our evolutionary history, not knowing where you stand in a relationship is a genuine source of activation. We're okay is information the system can process. I'm not sure we're okay is an open threat the system cannot archive. An ambiguous conversation stays alive not only because the sociometer has dropped. It also remains active because the need for cognitive closure has not been satisfied. The question, what is the other person thinking, remains unanswered, and as long as it remains unanswered, the system keeps processing it through the only tool it has available, internal simulation. Michael Tomasello, first at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and later at Duke University, spent decades developing a theory of what makes human cognition unique. His central argument is that humans possess a distinctive capacity he calls shared intentionality, something other primates do not possess in the same way. Shared intentionality is the ability to build mental states together with another person, to create, through interaction, a shared understanding that did not exist before. to align perspectives in such a way that both people know they are aligned and know that the other person knows it too. This is what makes language possible, what makes deep collaboration possible, what makes the uniquely human form of social connection possible. But it also creates a very specific vulnerability. When a conversation fails to create shared intentionality, when something is said but not understood as intended, when a misunderstanding occurs, when both people leave with different interpretations of what happened, the system registers the interaction as unfinished. The primary purpose of the conversation, to create alignment and establish mutual understanding, was never fulfilled. And the system that evolved to seek that alignment keeps trying to achieve it. Now, inside the simulation, because the real conversation is already over. Rehearsing a conversation that failed to create shared intentionality is, in that sense, the system's attempt to complete internally what the real conversation could not complete externally. But completing inside your own mind something that requires another person's participation is structurally impossible, and the attempt to do it is exactly what creates the endless loop. Think about situations where this pattern becomes unmistakable. A conversation with someone important, where you expressed an opinion, a concern, or a feeling, and the response was vague, generic, or simply not enough to reassure you that you had been understood as you intended. Over the following days, your mind reconstructs the scene again and again, searching for the version of your words that would have guaranteed real understanding. The rehearsal becomes more precise, more detailed, more nuanced than the original conversation ever was. But the original conversation has already happened, and no matter how much the system refines that better version, it will never reach the other person. Or imagine a situation where you said something that could reasonably be interpreted in more than one way. The other person never gave you any indication of which interpretation they took. Your need for cognitive closure remains unsatisfied because the question, what did they actually understand, has no available answer. So the system keeps processing, testing possibilities, projecting reactions, returning to the beginning. Because the only answer that would truly stop the loop is the one the other person would have to provide, and that answer is unavailable. There is another aspect of this pattern that is rarely discussed, yet it may be its greatest cost. Every rehearsal, every pass through the simulation, consumes real cognitive resources. Attention, working memory, executive processing. These are the very same resources you need to stay present in the current moment, to absorb new information, to sleep deeply enough for healthy memory consolidation, to think clearly about problems that actually have real-world solutions. Rehearsing conversations doesn't just occupy time that could be spent elsewhere. It consumes the mental resources the present needs in order to be fully experienced. And there is a direct connection between persistent conversation rehearsal and the pattern explored in the previous video, the difficulty of being fully present. Part of the reason the mind cannot settle into the present is that at that moment, its resources have already been allocated to processing a conversation the sociometer still considers unresolved. This isn't distraction, it's the system's priority. A priority established by the social nervous system, and one that will remain in place until the need for cognitive closure is satisfied in a way that internal rehearsal can never provide. There is an intuitive response to persistent conversation rehearsal that almost everyone tries at some point. Think harder, analyze more carefully, find the perfect wording, the argument no one could possibly refute, the explanation that would finally make everything clear. And what everything we've explored in this video reveals is why that strategy rarely works the way we hope it will. The sociometer is not searching for the perfect argument. It's searching for evidence that social acceptance has been restored, and that evidence cannot come from inside the simulation. It can only come from outside of it. The need for cognitive closure is not searching for the most sophisticated hypothesis. It's searching for a real answer to the question, what did the other person actually think? And that answer does not exist inside your internal simulation. It exists in real contact with the other person. Shared intentionality cannot be created inside a single mind. By definition, it requires two minds that are actually present. And the internal simulation of one of them is not the same as the presence of the other. What this reveals is something that seems counterintuitive at first, but becomes immediately clear once you see it this way. Rehearsing conversations is an attempt to solve, through internal processing, something that can only be resolved through real human contact. And the loop continues not because the system is irrational, but because it is rational enough to recognize that the answer it is looking for has not yet been found. So it keeps searching in the only place it has access to, its own mind. While the only place where the answer truly exists is outside the simulation, in the real relationship itself. What actually reduces persistent conversation rehearsal is not discovering the perfect wording inside your imagination. It is real contact that gives the sociometer the information it has been waiting for. A reply to a message that confirms the relationship is still intact. A meeting where the other person's behavior dissolves the ambiguity. A real conversation that, even if it doesn't resolve every unanswered question, communicates that the bond itself has not been broken. These real signals accomplish what hours of rehearsal never can. They provide the information the system has been searching for, not as a hypothesis, as data. And once that data arrives, the sociometer records, social acceptance restored. The need for cognitive closure receives, even if only partially, the answer it was waiting for. And without the urgency that was fueling it, the rehearsal gradually begins to lose its grip. This doesn't mean every ambiguous conversation has to be addressed directly. Sometimes time itself, and the other person's behavior, provides the signals the system needs without any additional conversation ever taking place. The important thing is recognizing that the rehearsal loop is a symptom, not the problem itself. The real problem is that the system is still waiting for a piece of social information it has not yet received, and trying to force the rehearsal to stop without providing that missing information rarely works. Because a system searching for signs of social acceptance doesn't stop searching simply because you decide it should. It stops when the information it has been seeking finally arrives, one way or another. Subscribe to follow what comes next on this channel, because each video builds on the previous one, and the next episode takes this story into an even broader territory. The social brain hypothesis, developed by Robin Dunbar at the University of Oxford, proposes that the human neocortex evolved primarily to manage the complexity of social networks, not to solve abstract problems or use tools. From this perspective, rehearsing conversations is the brain using the system exactly as it was designed, to process status, social positioning, and relationships within the group. Sociometer theory, proposed by Mark Leary at Duke University, describes self-esteem not as a fixed evaluation of oneself, but as a dynamic monitoring system that tracks perceived social acceptance. When an interaction suggests that acceptance may have been threatened, the sociometer drops and generates a specific form of anxiety that pushes the system to find a solution, including repeatedly rehearsing the interaction that triggered the drop. Rebecca Sachs's research at MIT on the temporoparietal junction identified the specific brain region activated during mentalizing, the process of simulating what another person is thinking and feeling. When we rehearse conversations, the temporoparietal junction actively constructs a model of the other person's mind, a model that is always an approximation, never the other person themselves. Nicholas Epley's research at the University of Chicago on mind reading and the illusion of transparency showed that people consistently overestimate the accuracy of their mental models of others. Conversation rehearsals are built around versions of other people that exist only inside our own minds. Versions that differ from the real person in ways the system rarely recognizes, creating a loop with no natural stopping point. The need for cognitive closure, a central concept in the work of Ari Kruglansky at the University of Maryland, describes the drive to reach a definite answer to unresolved questions, ambiguous social interactions, conversations that end without clear confirmation of where the relationship stands, activate this need without satisfying it, keeping the mind engaged until the question receives an answer. Shared intentionality, documented by Michael Tomasello at the Max Planck Institute and later at Duke University, refers to the uniquely human ability to build shared mental states with other people, to create mutual understanding that both people know is mutual. Conversations that fail to create that alignment leave the system trying to complete internally something that requires another person's presence to be completed, a structurally impossible task that keeps the rehearsal cycle alive indefinitely. If any part of this video describes something you've recognized in yourself, that specific loop of replaying and rehearsing conversations that always seems to need one more round, leave a comment below. Just one word, what stayed with you? Because recognizing that the loop is not a failure of thinking, but a system searching for social information it has not yet received completely changes the way you relate to it. But there's something about the pattern explored in this video that opens the door to something even bigger. Rehearsing conversations is a specific expression of it. It's the system monitoring a social interaction that never reached a clear resolution and trying to resolve inside the simulation what can only be resolved outside of it. But the same anticipatory capacity that conversation rehearsal relies on, the simulation of future scenarios, the search for problems that haven't happened yet, the monitoring of negative possibilities, doesn't stay limited to conversations. Over time, in systems that have become sufficiently sensitive to what could go wrong, it begins to generalize. It spreads beyond specific interactions to situations, periods of life, entire days. A good morning that immediately triggers the question, what is going to ruin this? A peaceful week that activates the search for the problem that hasn't appeared yet. Good news that quietly arrives accompanied by another question. But what's the catch? Not as rational risk analysis, as a background state. As the emotional tone through which the system processes the world once it has become calibrated for threat. Why does the nervous system learn to expect that something will go wrong, even when there is no concrete evidence that it will? And what keeps that state of negative anticipation alive long after any real danger has already passed? That's what we'll explore in the next video.